Have you ever wondered what it feels like when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones who turn their backs on you? Imagine being young, scared, and completely alone, standing outside the only home you've ever known, realizing that in a single moment everything has changed. No safety, no support, no one willing to stand beside you when the world suddenly becomes too heavy to carry. Tonight's story begins exactly there. At the moment when a life is shattered by judgment, pride, and the fear of what others might say. It begins with rejection so cold that it forces someone to grow up overnight. A teenager pushed into a world that offers no instructions, no guidance, and no second chances. A moment where humiliation replaces love, and survival becomes the only goal. But this is not just a story about loss. This is a story about resilience. Because sometimes the people who try to break you accidentally create the strongest version of you. Sometimes the door that is slammed in your face becomes the very reason you build a life so powerful that the past can never control you again. And sometimes the people who once believed you had nothing left to offer return years later, only to realize that time has rewritten the entire story. In the beginning, there was fear, there were nights filled with uncertainty, days filled with struggle, and a future that looked darker than anyone could imagine. But step by step, through determination, sacrifice, and unbreakable will, something extraordinary began to grow out of that pain. And years later, when the past suddenly returns knocking at the door, expecting forgiveness, expecting connection, expecting something they once rejected, the truth waiting for them is something they never saw coming. So stay with this story until the very end, because what begins as a tale of betrayal slowly transforms into something far more powerful. A story about dignity, a story about consequences, and most importantly, a story about how the greatest revenge is not anger, but becoming stronger than the people who once believed you would never survive. In our house, rules were not just rules, they were laws carved into stone. Everything revolved around one thing: reputation. My parents believed that the world was always watching us, judging us, measuring every action we took. From the way we spoke to the way we dressed, every detail had to reflect perfection. It didn't matter how we felt on the inside, because what mattered most to them was how things looked on the outside. Our home felt less like a place of warmth and more like a stage where everyone had a role to play. Smiles were rehearsed, conversations were controlled, and mistakes were treated like disasters waiting to destroy the family's name. My parents were respected in the community. People often praised them for raising such a well-behaved and disciplined child. Neighbors admired the clean house, the polite greetings, and the quiet obedience they saw whenever they visited. But what they didn't see were the silent pressures behind closed doors. Every test score had to be perfect. Every decision had to match the image my parents had carefully built over the years. Even small things, like laughing too loudly or speaking out of turn, were met with sharp looks that reminded me to stay within the boundaries. Dinner conversations often revolved around what other people thought. My parents talked about relatives who had shamed their families or neighbors whose children had made bad choices. Each story was told like a warning, a reminder that one mistake could ruin everything. I grew up understanding that love in our house was conditional. It existed only as long as I followed the path they had drawn for me. Deviating from it, even slightly, felt like stepping toward a cliff. Because of this, fear became a constant companion. I learned to hide my worries, my questions, and even my emotions. Instead of feeling safe enough to share problems, I carried them quietly, afraid that admitting any weakness would make me a disappointment. My parents weren't cruel in the obvious ways people imagine. They provided food, clothes, and a good school. But the atmosphere they created made it clear that perfection was not a goal, it was a requirement. In a home where reputation meant everything, there was no space for mistakes, no room for vulnerability, and no understanding for the unpredictable ways life can change in a single moment. The moment everything changed began like any ordinary day, quiet and predictable, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of place. The house carried its usual atmosphere of order and control. My parents moved through their routines with the same precision they expected from everyone around them. In a home where perfection was demanded, even the smallest disruption felt like a crack in a carefully built wall. But that day, the crack didn't stay small. It spread quickly, turning a normal afternoon into a moment that would shatter every expectation my parents had ever placed on me. It started with a discovery they never imagined they would have to face. For years, they believed they had raised someone who would never step outside the strict boundaries they had set. Their confidence came from the belief that discipline and fear were enough to guarantee obedience. But life doesn't follow carefully written rules, and reality has a way of exposing the limits of control. When the truth surfaced, it arrived like a thunderclap in the middle of their perfectly structured world. At first, there was disbelief. The idea that something so serious could happen under their roof seemed impossible to them. Their faces showed confusion before the anger arrived. Questions were fired rapidly, sharp and relentless, not because they wanted to understand, but because they were searching for someone to blame. Every word carried the weight of their shock. The house, which had always felt tense, suddenly became suffocating. Their reaction wasn't quiet disappointment or concern. It was explosive, filled with accusations and disbelief. In their minds, this discovery wasn't just a personal issue. It was a threat to everything they had built their identity around. The thought of what relatives, neighbors, and friends might say hung heavily in the air. To them, the situation represented humiliation, a stain on the image they had spent years protecting. Voices grew louder. Harsh words replaced calm conversation. Instead of trying to understand how such a situation had unfolded, they focused on the damage it could cause to their reputation. Every sentence they spoke made it clear that their biggest fear wasn't the pain or confusion involved in the situation. Their fear was the judgment of others. In that moment, the distance between parent and child grew wider than it had ever been. What should have been a moment of guidance and protection became something else entirely, an emotional storm driven by shock, pride, and the overwhelming realization that their carefully controlled world had just been turned upside down. The anger came quickly, almost instantly after the shock faded. Instead of concern or quiet conversation, the atmosphere filled with tension that felt sharp enough to cut through the air. My parents' faces hardened in a way I had never seen before. Their voices, usually controlled and careful in front of others, turned cold and harsh. It was as if compassion had completely disappeared, replaced by wounded pride and embarrassment. To them, the situation was not about fear, confusion, or the need for support. It was about what people would say. I could see it in the way they paced the room, the way they spoke about neighbors, relatives, and the community. Every sentence carried the same underlying worry: how this would look to the outside world. Their disappointment wasn't quiet or reflective. It came out as accusations, questions that were less about understanding and more about blaming. Instead of asking how things had reached this point, they focused on how it would affect their image. They spoke about sacrifice, about all the years they had spent building respect and trust in the community. They repeated how hard they had worked to create a family that others admired. In their eyes, everything they had built was now under threat. The problem, as they saw it, wasn't the pain or fear I might have been experiencing. The problem was the shame they believed this situation would bring to them. Their words grew sharper as the conversation continued. They spoke about disappointment as if it were a crime that had been committed against them personally. Every sentence felt like another wall being built between us. I had always believed that parents were supposed to protect their children during difficult moments, but in that moment it became clear that protection was not what they were offering. What hurt the most was the realization that compassion was not even being considered. The possibility of offering understanding or comfort seemed completely absent. Instead, the focus remained fixed on pride and reputation. It felt as if their love depended entirely on maintaining a perfect image, and the moment that image was threatened, that love began to disappear. The room that once represented family now felt like a courtroom. Every word spoken sounded like a judgment, every look like a verdict already decided. In that moment, it became painfully clear that pride had taken priority over compassion, and the emotional distance between us was growing wider with every passing second. The news did not stay inside the walls of the house for long. In a community where people paid close attention to each other's lives, secrets rarely remained hidden. What began as a painful moment within the family soon became something much larger. Whispers started quietly, passed between neighbors during evening walks, shared between relatives during phone calls, and repeated again and again until the story spread far beyond what anyone could control. Relatives who had once spoken kindly suddenly looked at me differently. Their expressions carried judgment before they even opened their mouths. Some tried to hide their reactions behind polite smiles, but the disappointment in their eyes was impossible to ignore. Others didn't bother pretending. They spoke openly about how shocking the situation was, as if discussing a scandal rather than a human life. Family gatherings, which had once been filled with normal conversations, turned uncomfortable and tense. People lowered their voices when I walked into the room, but the silence that followed made their thoughts obvious. A few relatives asked questions that sounded more like accusations than concern. They talked about responsibility, about mistakes, about how such a situation could bring embarrassment to the entire family. It felt as if everyone had suddenly become a judge, eager to offer opinions without understanding the reality behind the situation. Neighbors were no different. Some stared openly whenever I stepped outside, others whispered behind doors or across fences, their curiosity stronger than their compassion. The neighborhood that had once felt familiar now seemed hostile. Even simple tasks like walking down the street felt overwhelming, as if every pair of eyes carried silent criticism. The humiliation wasn't always loud or dramatic. Often it appeared in smaller moments that cut just as deeply. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. People exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. A few individuals offered advice disguised as sympathy, but their tone made it clear they believed the situation was proof of failure. The worst part was knowing that my parents felt the weight of that judgment as well. Instead of protecting me from it, their frustration grew stronger with every comment they heard from others. The pressure of public opinion turned the situation into something larger than a personal struggle. It became a spectacle in the eyes of the community. In a place where reputation meant everything, the whispers, the stares, and the quiet conversations carried enormous power, turning private pain into public humiliation. The decision did not come after calm discussion or careful thought. It arrived suddenly, carried by anger and pride that had been building for days. The tension in the house had been growing heavier with every passing hour, and it was clear that my parents believed there was only one way to deal with what they saw as a problem. Their voices were firm and final, leaving no space for negotiation or understanding. They spoke as if the situation had left them no choice. To them, allowing me to remain in the house would mean accepting something they believed would destroy their reputation. The fear of what others might say had grown stronger than any sense of responsibility or compassion. Their words made it painfully clear that protecting their image in the community mattered more than protecting their own child. I remember standing in the middle of the living room while they listed all the reasons why I could no longer stay. Every sentence felt like a door closing. They talked about shame, about the example it would set for others, about how people would question their values if they allowed the situation to remain under their roof. It felt less like a family conversation and more like a verdict that had already been decided long before the discussion even began. The moment became even more surreal when they began pointing toward the door. There were no plans offered, no guidance about where to go or how to survive outside the home. The expectation was simple: leave and do not return. The house that had once been the only place I had ever known suddenly felt like unfamiliar territory, a place where I was no longer welcome. Packing belongings happened quickly and without emotion from their side. A few clothes were gathered, placed into a small bag, as if preparing for a short trip rather than a permanent separation. Every movement felt rushed, almost impatient, as though they wanted the situation to disappear as quickly as possible. Walking toward the door was one of the most painful moments imaginable. Each step carried the realization that the safety and stability I had always assumed existed could vanish so easily. There were no comforting words, no attempts to soften the moment, only silence and cold expressions remained. When the door finally closed behind me, it marked more than just leaving a house. It marked the sudden end of childhood security and the beginning of facing the world alone, without guidance, protection, or the support that parents are expected to provide. The moment the door closed behind me, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Just hours earlier, there had still been a roof that felt permanent, walls that seemed unbreakable, and the belief that no matter what happened, home would always exist as a place to return to. Now that certainty had disappeared. Standing outside with a small bag and nowhere to go created a kind of silence inside my mind that felt heavier than any noise. Abandonment is not only about losing a place to live, it is the sudden understanding that the people who are supposed to protect you have chosen to step away when you need them most. That realization cuts deeper than any harsh word. It changes the way you look at the world, turning familiar ideas about safety and trust into questions that no longer have simple answers. Fear quickly became a constant presence. Every thought began to revolve around basic survival. Where would I sleep that night? How would I find food? Who could I trust enough to ask for help without risking more judgment or rejection? Questions like these filled every moment, leaving little space for anything else. The world felt much larger and far more dangerous than it ever had before. At the same time, there was an overwhelming emotional weight that refused to fade. Memories of home, even the difficult ones, kept replaying in my mind. I thought about the normal routines that had once seemed ordinary, sitting at the dinner table, hearing familiar voices in the hallway, seeing lights on in the house at night. Those memories suddenly felt distant, like scenes from a life that belonged to someone else. Loneliness became another challenge that was difficult to describe. Being surrounded by strangers in busy streets or crowded places did not remove the feeling of isolation. In fact, it sometimes made it worse. Watching other families move through their daily lives together created a sharp reminder of what had been lost. The emotional strain of facing such uncertainty at a young age forced me to grow up faster than I ever expected. Every decision carried real consequences, and every mistake could make survival even harder. The comfort of relying on parents for guidance had disappeared completely, replaced by the need to rely only on my own judgment and strength. During those first days and nights, the combination of fear, loneliness, and confusion formed a heavy burden, one that no teenager should ever have to carry alone. The first days alone felt like stepping into a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and unpredictable. Survival was no longer an abstract idea, it was something that demanded attention every hour of the day. Without the structure of a home or the guidance of adults, every decision had to be made carefully. Even the simplest questions, like where to spend the night or how to find the next meal, became complicated challenges that required courage and quick thinking. Finding a safe place to sleep was the first and most urgent struggle. Nights felt longer than they ever had before, filled with uncertainty and quiet fear. The thought of being completely alone in unfamiliar places created a constant sense of alertness, as if danger could appear at any moment. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. Safety was no longer guaranteed by locked doors or familiar walls, so each evening became a search for somewhere that felt even slightly secure. Food quickly became another pressing concern. Meals that once appeared on the table without a second thought now required effort and planning. Hunger has a way of sharpening the mind, forcing you to look for opportunities wherever they might exist. Sometimes that meant searching for small jobs or accepting help from people who offered kindness without asking too many questions. Other times it meant stretching whatever little resources were available and learning how to make them last longer than they should have. The outside world, which once seemed distant and manageable, suddenly felt enormous. Streets, buildings, and crowds were filled with people who had their own lives and problems, most of them unaware that someone nearby was struggling just to get through the day. Moving through those spaces required caution. Trust could not be given easily because not everyone who offered help had good intentions. At the same time, there were moments when unexpected kindness appeared. A stranger offering a small piece of advice, someone pointing toward a safe place to rest, or a brief conversation that reminded me that not everyone in the world was harsh or judgmental. Those moments didn't erase the hardship, but they helped keep hope alive during the most difficult days. Every hour demanded strength and determination. Instead of worrying about the future in distant terms, life became about surviving the present moment, finding shelter, food, and safety, while learning how to navigate a world that had suddenly become both frightening and unforgiving. Life outside the protection of a home had a way of teaching lessons faster than any classroom ever could. Situations that most teenagers would never have to think about became daily realities, forcing me to grow up in ways I had never expected. Every challenge carried a new piece of understanding, and every mistake brought consequences that could not be ignored. The world no longer felt distant or theoretical. It became immediate, practical, and sometimes unforgiving. One of the first lessons was the true value of independence. When there is no one to rely on for guidance or support, every choice matters more. Small decisions, where to go, who to trust, how to manage limited resources, could shape the outcome of an entire day. This kind of responsibility demanded constant awareness. I had to pay attention to people's expressions, their tone of voice, and the way they behaved, learning quickly how to recognize when someone was sincere and when caution was necessary. Another lesson was understanding how fragile stability can be. Things that once seemed permanent, like a roof over my head or a warm meal at night, were suddenly uncertain. That realization changed the way I viewed everything. Comfort could not be taken for granted, and security was something that had to be built carefully rather than assumed. It created a mindset where preparation and resilience became essential. I also learned how important self-control and patience could be. In difficult situations, reacting emotionally often made things worse. Anger, fear, and frustration were natural responses, but they had to be managed carefully. Staying calm made it easier to think clearly and find solutions to problems that might otherwise feel overwhelming. At the same time, the experience revealed how differently people handle hardship. Some individuals responded to my situation with kindness and encouragement, even if they were strangers who had no obligation to help. Their small acts of generosity left a lasting impression. Others reacted with suspicion or indifference, reminding me that the world could be both compassionate and harsh at the same time. These experiences forced maturity to arrive much earlier than it should have. Instead of worrying about ordinary teenage concerns, life became a continuous process of learning how to adapt, endure, and move forward despite uncertainty. Each day added another layer of understanding about survival, responsibility, and the strength required to continue, even when the path ahead remained unclear. Pain has a strange way of changing people. At first, it feels heavy and overwhelming, like something that exists only to break you down. During the early days of struggling alone, the memories of rejection and humiliation constantly replayed in my mind. Every harsh word, every judgmental stare, every moment of being told I was no longer welcome seemed to echo again and again. It would have been easy to let those memories turn into bitterness or hopelessness, but something slowly began to shift. Instead of seeing those painful experiences as proof that life was over, I started to see them as a challenge that demanded a response. The world had already shown me how cruel it could be, and I realized that surrendering to that cruelty would only prove the people who doubted me right. That thought created a small but powerful spark of determination. Determination doesn't arrive suddenly like a dramatic moment in a story. It grows quietly through repeated decisions to keep moving forward even when the path feels impossible. Each day presented obstacles that could easily have led to giving up. Finding work, managing limited resources, and facing judgment from others required constant effort. But with every small success, earning a little money, finding a safer place to stay, solving a problem without anyone's help, the belief that I could survive began to grow stronger. The rejection that once felt like a crushing weight slowly became something different. Instead of seeing it only as abandonment, I began to treat it as motivation. If people believed that my life was destined to fail, then proving them wrong became a powerful reason to keep pushing forward. Their doubts, which once caused pain, started to fuel a quiet determination to build something better. Over time, this mindset changed the way I approached every challenge. Difficult situations no longer felt like the end of the road. They became tests of resilience and patience. The fear that had once dominated my thoughts began to lose its power as confidence slowly replaced it. This transformation didn't erase the past or the hurt that came with it. Those memories remained, but they no longer controlled the direction of my life. Instead, they served as reminders of how far I had come and why giving up was never an option. Pain, which once threatened to destroy everything, became the very force that strengthened the determination to rise above it. Survival eventually required more than just getting through each day. It demanded building a future, even if that future seemed distant and uncertain. The first step toward that goal was finding work. At the beginning, the options were limited. Without experience or strong connections, most opportunities were small and physically demanding. Tasks that others might consider temporary became essential lifelines. Cleaning, organizing, carrying supplies, or helping in small shops were the kinds of jobs that provided a little money and a small sense of stability. Working multiple jobs soon became part of daily life. One job alone rarely paid enough to cover basic needs, so time had to be managed carefully. Early mornings often started with one type of work, followed by another task later in the day. Evenings sometimes meant helping someone else with small responsibilities just to earn a little extra. The days were long and exhausting, but every bit of effort felt necessary because it meant moving one step further away from the helplessness of those first nights alone. At the same time, the idea of education remained important. Despite everything that had happened, there was a quiet understanding that knowledge could open doors that hard labor alone might not. Continuing to learn required creativity and persistence. Books had to be borrowed whenever possible. Lessons were sometimes followed from a distance, listening carefully and absorbing information in any way available. Studying didn't happen in comfortable classrooms or quiet bedrooms anymore. It happened wherever a moment of peace could be found. Balancing work and learning demanded discipline. After long hours of physical effort, focusing on reading or practicing lessons felt incredibly difficult. Fatigue often made concentration harder, but the desire for a better future pushed those struggles aside. Each new piece of knowledge felt like a small investment in a life that could eventually become more stable and independent. There were moments when the pressure of maintaining both work and education felt overwhelming. Doubts appeared, questioning whether all the effort would truly lead to something better. But giving up would have meant accepting the limitations others had already placed on me. Slowly, through persistence and determination, the routine of working hard while continuing to learn began shaping a path forward. What started as a desperate attempt to survive gradually turned into a steady effort to build a future that no longer depended on anyone else's approval or support. Independence is rarely something people plan to develop at such a young age. For most teenagers, it grows slowly over time with the support and guidance of family. But when that support disappears suddenly, independence is no longer a gradual process. It becomes a necessity, something that must be learned quickly in order to survive. The experience of being left to face the world alone forced me to rely on myself in ways I had never imagined before. At first, the responsibility felt overwhelming. Every decision carried weight because there was no one to consult for advice or reassurance. Even small choices required careful thought. Where to go next, how to manage money, and how to respond to difficult situations became questions that had to be answered alone. In the beginning, the pressure of making those decisions created constant anxiety, because the possibility of making the wrong choice always felt close. Over time, however, something began to change. Each challenge that was faced and overcome added a small layer of confidence. Finding solutions to problems without anyone's help proved that strength existed even during the hardest moments. The process of handling responsibilities alone slowly replaced fear with a sense of capability. Situations that once seemed impossible started to feel manageable. This independence was not only practical but emotional as well. Betrayal from family left deep scars that made trust difficult. Learning to protect my own well-being became just as important as learning how to earn money or find shelter. It meant understanding that my worth did not depend on the opinions of people who had already rejected me. That realization created a quiet form of resilience that helped shield me from the judgments of others. Independence also meant discovering personal values that were separate from the expectations of the past. Instead of living according to rules designed to satisfy someone else's reputation, I began to understand what truly mattered to me. Respect, perseverance, and honesty became guiding principles not because they were demanded by anyone, but because they felt right. Through years of navigating life without a safety net, independence transformed from a frightening burden into a source of strength. It shaped the ability to face uncertainty with determination, and to continue building a life that was no longer defined by rejection but by the resilience developed through overcoming it. Building a new life did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden transformation where everything improved at once. Instead, it was a slow process made up of small steps, repeated efforts, and quiet determination. After facing rejection and hardship, the most important realization was that the future could not depend on the approval of the people who had turned their backs on me. If life was going to move forward, it had to be built on something stronger than the opinions of others. That foundation became self-respect and resilience. Self-respect started with the decision to stop seeing myself through the harsh judgments that had once been thrown at me. For a long time, those words echoed in my mind, making it easy to doubt my own worth. But gradually, I began to understand that mistakes or difficult circumstances did not erase the value of a person. Recognizing that truth was the first step toward rebuilding confidence. It meant refusing to accept the idea that my life was defined by a single moment or by someone else's expectations. Resilience grew alongside that self-respect. Every challenge faced in those early years, long working hours, financial struggles, moments of loneliness, became a test of endurance. Instead of allowing those difficulties to break me down, they slowly strengthened my ability to continue moving forward. Each obstacle overcome added proof that persistence could create progress, even when the journey felt exhausting. As time passed, small achievements began to form the structure of a new life. Steady work created financial stability that had once seemed impossible. Education opened doors to opportunities that expanded the future beyond simple survival. Relationships with people who valued kindness and honesty helped replace the isolation that had once dominated daily life. This new life was very different from the one I had grown up in. It was not built on the pressure to appear perfect or to maintain a certain image in front of others. Instead, it was built on authenticity and hard-earned confidence. The struggles of the past did not disappear, but they became part of the strength that supported everything moving forward. through patience and determination, the broken pieces of the past were gradually replaced with something stronger, a life shaped by independence, dignity, and the unwavering belief that resilience could transform even the most painful beginnings into a future worth fighting for. Time has a quiet way of transforming people and circumstances. In the beginning, every day had felt like a battle just to survive, each moment filled with uncertainty about what the future might hold. But as the years slowly passed, the chaos of those early struggles began to settle into something more stable. The frightened teenager who had once been forced to face the world alone gradually evolved into someone stronger, someone shaped by experience rather than controlled by fear. The change did not happen through one single event. It was the result of countless days of effort, persistence, and learning from every challenge that appeared along the way. The early years of hardship built a deep understanding of responsibility and self-reliance. Each job taken, each lesson learned, and each obstacle overcome added another layer of growth. What once felt impossible slowly became manageable, and eventually those small victories began to accumulate into real progress. With time came greater stability. The long hours of work started to produce results that were visible not only in financial security but also in confidence. Opportunities that once seemed far out of reach began to appear, opening doors to new possibilities. Education and practical experience combined to create skills that allowed life to move beyond simple survival and toward genuine success. Confidence replaced the fear that had once dominated every decision. Instead of constantly worrying about how to get through the next day, it became possible to think about the future in broader terms. Plans could be made, goals could be set, and the idea of building a meaningful life no longer seemed unrealistic. What made the transformation even more powerful was the quiet realization of how far the journey had come. Looking back at the past revealed a stark contrast between the uncertainty of those early days and the stability that now existed. The struggles that once felt unbearable had shaped resilience and determination that few people ever develop so early in life. The person who had once been rejected and abandoned had grown into someone independent, capable, and successful in ways that could never have been predicted during those difficult moments. Years of perseverance had turned pain into strength, and the life that had once seemed shattered had been rebuilt into something far more powerful than anyone had expected. As the years continued to pass, life moved forward in ways that no one could have predicted. The struggles that once dominated every moment gradually became memories, lessons that shaped the path ahead rather than obstacles that blocked it. While my own life was changing through determination and hard work, time was also working quietly on the people who had once made the decision to push me away. Age has a way of softening certainty and forcing people to reflect on choices they once believed were justified. For my parents, the years brought a different kind of realization. The confidence they once carried about their decisions slowly began to fade as life changed around them. When the moment of rejection happened, they had been convinced they were protecting their reputation and preserving the values they believed were important. In their minds, the choice seemed necessary, even if it felt harsh at the time. But time often reveals the deeper consequences of actions that once seemed simple. As they grew older, the house that had once been filled with strict rules and constant expectations likely became quieter. The energy of maintaining a perfect image in the community no longer held the same importance it once had. People who had once shared their opinions and gossip about family matters moved on with their own lives. The whispers that had once felt so powerful faded into the background, leaving behind only the reality of what had been lost. Regret does not always appear suddenly. Sometimes it develops slowly, appearing in quiet moments when people begin to reconsider their past decisions. My parents may have started to remember the day everything changed, replaying the arguments and harsh words that led to that final moment at the door. What once felt like a firm decision might have started to look different through the lens of time and reflection. The understanding that a family bond had been broken may have created a growing sense of emptiness. Realizing that years had passed without connection or communication could not have been easy to ignore. With age often comes a deeper awareness of the importance of relationships and the knowledge that some choices cannot be undone. What had once been a decision made in anger and pride slowly turned into something heavier, a quiet recognition that the consequences of that moment had lasted far longer than anyone expected. Years had passed without a single word between us. Life had moved forward in separate directions, creating distance that felt permanent. The silence had become normal, almost expected, and the idea of hearing from my parents again seemed unlikely. For a long time, it felt as though the chapter of my life that included them had closed completely. The memories remained, but they existed quietly in the background, while my focus stayed on building the life I had worked so hard to create. Then one day, something unexpected happened. After all those years of silence, they reached out. The message did not arrive with dramatic warnings or emotional explanations. It appeared suddenly, breaking through the long stretch of distance that had existed for so long. Seeing their names again after all that time created a strange mixture of emotions that were difficult to sort through. At first there was disbelief. It was hard to understand why they would contact me after so many years without any attempt to reconnect. The silence had been their choice, just as much as the decision to send me away had been. Because of that history, the sudden reappearance felt almost unreal, as if the past had unexpectedly stepped back into the present. Curiosity quickly followed that initial shock. Questions began forming immediately. What had changed? Why now, after so many years? The timing felt too sudden to ignore, especially considering how firmly they had once decided to remove me from their lives. Their message carried a tone that was very different from the harsh certainty they had shown in the past. There was also a sense of emotional tension in that moment. Hearing from them again meant confronting memories that had been carefully pushed aside while building a new life. The past, which had once caused so much pain, suddenly felt closer than it had in years. Despite all those mixed emotions, the contact itself represented something significant. The same people who had once been so certain that they wanted nothing more to do with me were now the ones reopening the door to communication. After years of silence, the unexpected return of their voices created a moment that felt both surprising and deeply complicated, bringing the past and present together in a way that could not be ignored. When the conversation finally began after years of silence, the difference in their tone was immediately noticeable. The same voices that once carried anger and certainty now sounded hesitant, almost careful. It was as if the confidence they once had in their decisions had faded with time. Instead of harsh accusations or firm judgments, their words were slower, softer, and filled with a kind of nervous politeness that had never existed before. They spoke as though they were trying to rebuild a connection that had never been broken, carefully choosing phrases that sounded warm and friendly. There were attempts to talk about ordinary things, asking questions about life, work, and how the years had been. On the surface, it sounded like the kind of conversation parents might have with someone they had always supported. But beneath those words was the memory of everything that had happened before, a history that made their sudden friendliness feel strange and unfamiliar. What stood out the most was the shift in attitude. The strict authority they once carried had disappeared. There were no lectures about reputation, no reminders about family expectations, and no criticism about past choices. Instead, they spoke with a kind of humility that suggested they understood things differently now. Their voices carried a tone that almost sounded apologetic. Though the words themselves avoided directly addressing the past, the change was difficult to ignore. Years earlier, they had treated the situation as something that deserved rejection and punishment. Now their behavior suggested that they wanted something very different. They asked questions that hinted at curiosity about my life, as if they were trying to understand what had happened during all the years they had been absent. At the same time, the conversation carried an unusual tension. Their kindness felt genuine in some moments, but there was also a sense that the warmth had appeared very suddenly. After so many years of distance, it was impossible not to wonder what had caused such a dramatic shift in their attitude. The people who had once closed the door without hesitation were now approaching the situation with caution and unexpected warmth. Their sudden change in behavior created a complicated atmosphere, one where politeness and curiosity replaced the anger of the past, but where the deeper reasons behind their new approach still remained unclear. As the conversations continued, the initial politeness slowly began to reveal something deeper beneath the surface. At first, their words sounded like an attempt to reconnect after years of separation. They asked about life, about work, about how things had turned out. Their tone remained gentle, almost cautious, as if they were afraid of pushing too hard or reopening old wounds too quickly. But the more they spoke, the more a subtle pattern started to appear in the way they guided the conversation. Instead of focusing only on rebuilding a relationship, they seemed particularly interested in one specific part of my life. Certain questions appeared again and again, sometimes asked directly and sometimes mentioned casually in passing. At first, it seemed like simple curiosity, the kind of curiosity parents might have after missing many years of someone's life. But gradually, the repetition made their intentions harder to ignore. There was a noticeable shift in the way they spoke whenever that subject came up. Their voices carried a kind of excitement that hadn't been present earlier in the conversation. The hesitation that had marked their earlier words faded, replaced by eagerness and expectation. It became clear that this was not just a casual interest but something they cared about deeply. Listening carefully, I began to understand that their sudden return was not entirely about regret or a desire to repair what had been broken. Their attention kept returning to the same idea, the same possibility they seemed eager to confirm. It was as though they had already imagined a certain outcome and now wanted reassurance that it existed. That realization created a strange emotional distance. The warmth in their voices began to feel less like genuine reconciliation and more like anticipation. It raised a difficult question about why they had truly reached out after so many years of silence. If rebuilding the relationship had been their only goal, the focus of the conversation would have remained on understanding the past and repairing the bond that had been destroyed. Instead, their questions revealed that their interest was tied to something they expected to gain from reconnecting. The kindness they showed now seemed connected to that expectation, as though the years of silence had ended not simply because of regret, but because they believed something important awaited them at the other end of that conversation. As the conversation continued, the weight of the past slowly began to surface. What had started as polite exchanges and cautious questions gradually moved towards something far more serious. It became clear that avoiding the history between us was no longer possible. The years of silence, the rejection, and the pain that followed had created wounds that could not simply be ignored by pretending everything was normal. The moment the conversation turned toward those memories, the atmosphere shifted. Their voices, which had carried a hopeful tone earlier, grew quieter and more uncertain. Speaking about the past meant confronting the choices that had led to our separation, and that was not an easy subject for anyone involved. There was hesitation in their words, as if they were unsure how to address something that had changed so many lives. For me, revisiting those memories brought back emotions that had once been overwhelming. The night I was forced to leave, the fear of facing the world alone, and the years of struggling to survive all returned vividly. Those experiences had shaped who I had become, and remembering them reminded me just how deep the pain had once been. At the same time, those memories also revealed how much strength had grown from those hardships. The power dynamic between us had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. Years earlier, my parents had held complete authority. They were the ones who decided what was right and what was wrong, who belonged in the family and who did not. Back then, their words carried finality, and there had been no room to challenge their decisions. Now the situation was very different. The teenager who once had no choice but to accept their judgment had grown into someone independent and self-reliant. The balance of control had quietly shifted over time. Instead of standing in a position of weakness, I now had the ability to decide how much of the past I was willing to revisit and how much influence they would have in my life moving forward. That realization created a powerful tension in the conversation. The past and present were meeting face to face, and both sides understood that the roles we once played had changed in ways none of us could ignore. As the conversation continued, memories that had once been buried beneath years of hard work and determination began to rise again. The past has a way of returning when it is least expected, especially when the people connected to those memories suddenly reappear. Hearing my parents' voices again reopened moments I had spent a long time trying to move beyond. The distance created by time did not erase what had happened, it only placed it in the background until something brought it forward again. Each word they spoke seemed to pull another memory into focus. I remembered standing in the living room during the argument that changed everything, the sharp tone in their voices and the expressions that showed more anger than understanding. I remembered the humiliation of hearing relatives talk about the situation as if it were a scandal, rather than a painful reality. Those scenes returned vividly, almost as if they had happened yesterday instead of years ago. The night I was forced to leave also came back clearly in my mind. I could still picture the door closing behind me, and the strange silence that followed. The world outside that house had felt enormous and frightening, filled with uncertainty about where I would go or how I would survive. Those early days of loneliness and fear had been some of the hardest moments of my life, and remembering them reminded me just how much strength it had taken to keep moving forward. What made the memories even more powerful was the contrast between who I had been then and who I had become. Back then, I was a teenager struggling to understand why my own family had chosen rejection instead of support. Now I was someone who had spent years building a life through determination and resilience. The pain of the past still existed, but it no longer defined my future. Revisiting those memories created a complicated mixture of emotions. There was sadness for what had been lost and for the years that could never be returned. At the same time, there was also a quiet pride in knowing that those experiences had not destroyed me. The past, once pushed aside to make room for survival and growth, was now standing in the room again, reminding everyone involved of the choices that had shaped the path that followed. As the conversation continued, a subtle but undeniable shift in control became more visible. Years earlier, my parents had been the ones who held all the power in the relationship. Their rules defined the household, their expectations shaped every decision, and their judgments determined what was considered acceptable. When they decided that I could no longer stay in their home, the choice had been entirely theirs. At that time, I had no authority to challenge them, no independence to change the outcome, and no control over what would happen next. But time had quietly rewritten those roles. The teenager who once depended completely on their approval had grown into someone capable of standing alone. The years of struggle had forced me to develop strength, independence, and confidence that could never have existed if life had remained comfortable and predictable. Without realizing it, the balance between us had shifted. During the conversation, this change became clear in the way decisions were now made. My parents approached the discussion with caution, choosing their words carefully as though they were unsure how I might respond. The certainty they once carried had been replaced by hesitation. Instead of speaking with authority, they now waited for my reactions, measuring their words as if they understood that the direction of the conversation no longer belonged entirely to them. For me, the difference was impossible to ignore. Years earlier, I had been the one trying to explain, hoping to be heard, while they refused to listen. Now the situation was reversed. I was the one deciding how much to say, how much to reveal, and how far the conversation would go. The power to continue or end the discussion rested entirely in my hands. This shift created an unusual emotional tension. My parents, who had once controlled every aspect of the situation, were now standing in a position where they needed something from me. Their willingness to reach out and reconnect showed that they understood this change, even if they never said it directly. The past had been shaped by their decisions, but the present belonged to a different reality. The roles that once defined our relationship had quietly reversed, leaving them in a position of uncertainty, while I held the control they once believed would always belong to them. As the conversation unfolded further, the moment finally arrived when their true request became impossible to hide. Up until then, the discussion had been filled with cautious words and indirect questions, as if they were slowly building towards something they had been waiting to ask. The hesitation in their voices suggested they knew the subject carried weight, yet the anticipation behind their curiosity had grown too strong to keep concealed any longer. When they finally spoke openly about what they wanted, the change in their tone was unmistakable. The careful politeness that had guided the earlier part of the conversation was replaced by an urgency that revealed how important this request was to them. It was no longer just a casual topic mentioned in passing, it had clearly been the reason they had reached out after so many years of silence. Their words carried a mixture of hope and expectation. They spoke as if they believed time had softened everything that had happened before. In their minds, enough years had passed that the pain of the past should have faded. They seemed to imagine that reconnecting now could lead to something they desired deeply, something that they believed had been waiting quietly in the background all along. Listening to them describe what they wanted created a powerful sense of irony. The same people who had once rejected responsibility and turned their backs during the most difficult moment were now speaking with longing and excitement. Their request reflected a belief that the past could simply be set aside, replaced by a new chapter that would fulfill the expectations they now held. There was also a sense of vulnerability in their voices. The confidence they once carried had disappeared, replaced by a need that made them sound almost desperate. They asked questions carefully, hoping for answers that would confirm their hopes. Every response I gave seemed to matter deeply to them, as if each word could bring them closer to what they were wishing for. The moment was striking because it revealed how much their perspective had changed. Years ago, they had pushed away the responsibilities and consequences that came with their decision. Now they were asking for something connected to the very future they had once refused to accept. The conversation eventually reached a moment where the expectations they carried could no longer remain unchallenged. For a long time they had spoken with a sense of quiet anticipation, as if they believed their request would naturally lead to the outcome they imagined. The hope in their voices suggested they had already built a picture in their minds of how things would unfold. They seemed convinced that time had healed the past and that the future they wanted was simply waiting to be confirmed. When the truth was finally spoken, the reaction was immediate and impossible to hide. The confidence and excitement that had guided their earlier words suddenly disappeared. In its place came silence, the kind of silence that arrives when a person hears something they were never prepared to accept. Their expectations had been built on an assumption that reality did not support, and realizing that created a moment of shock that filled the space between us. Their voices changed as they tried to process what they had just heard. The certainty that had once defined their perspective was gone, replaced by confusion and disbelief. It was clear that they had imagined a completely different outcome, one where their hopes would be fulfilled and the past could be rewritten into something more comfortable. Instead, they were now facing a reality that challenged everything they had expected. The truth carried a powerful weight because it forced them to confront the consequences of their earlier choices. Years ago, they had made a decision based on pride, reputation, and fear of judgment from others. At the time, they believed they were protecting their lives from shame and embarrassment. But the revelation they were hearing now made it clear that those decisions had shaped the future in ways they had never fully considered. There was a sense of realization slowly forming in the way they responded. The silence between their words suggested that they were beginning to understand how the past had closed doors that could never be reopened. The expectations they had carried into the conversation were colliding with a truth that left them stunned, forcing them to recognize that the future they had imagined simply did not exist. The moment after the truth was revealed carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. The silence that followed was not just shock, it was the slow realization that the expectations they had built over the years had collapsed in an instant. For a long time, my parents had believed they could return one day and reclaim something they thought still existed. They seemed convinced that time alone would repair everything that had been broken, and that the past could simply be left behind without consequence. But reality does not work that way. The choices people make often travel far into the future, shaping outcomes long after the original moment has passed. The decision they made years ago, driven by pride and fear of public judgment, had created a path that could not be undone. At the time, they believed they were protecting themselves from shame. Now they were facing the quiet but powerful result of that decision. The irony of the situation was impossible to overlook. The same people who had once rejected responsibility during the most vulnerable moment were now asking for something deeply connected to that very moment. Back then, they had treated the situation as something that threatened their reputation, something that needed to be removed from their lives as quickly as possible. Their solution had been to close the door and pretend the problem no longer existed. Years later, they had returned expecting to find the future they once refused to accept. In their minds, they believed that reconnecting would bring them closer to a life they had imagined. Instead, they were confronted with a truth that reflected the consequences of their earlier actions. This moment carried a sense of poetic justice. It was not about revenge spoken through anger or cruelty. The power of the moment came from the simple reality that actions have lasting results. The pain that had once been placed entirely on my shoulders had slowly turned into a lesson that now stood directly in front of them. They were no longer speaking with certainty or expectation. The silence in their voices revealed an understanding that the past could not be erased, and that the choices made long ago had shaped a future very different from the one they had hoped to claim. After the silence settled and the reality of the situation became clear, another decision quietly stood in front of me. It was not about proving a point or seeking revenge through harsh words. The real question was whether reopening the door to the past would bring anything meaningful into the life I had worked so hard to build. Years earlier, I had been forced to leave with nothing but uncertainty and fear. Everything that came afterward had been created through persistence, sacrifice, and the determination to survive, without the support that should have been there. Looking back on those years made one thing very clear. The strength that allowed me to rebuild my life had grown from learning how to protect my own dignity. Every difficult day, every exhausting job, and every moment of loneliness had slowly shaped a person who understood the value of self-respect. That understanding made the present moment easier to see clearly. My parents were now reaching out with hopes and expectations, but the truth was that the past had left scars that time alone could not erase. Forgiveness is often described as something noble, something that brings peace and closure. But forgiveness also requires genuine understanding, accountability, and a willingness to repair the damage that was done. Without those elements, simply pretending the pain never happened would not heal anything. Allowing the past to return without boundaries could risk reopening wounds that had taken years to close. The life I had built was stable and meaningful, precisely because it had been created, without relying on people who had once turned away. Protecting that stability meant being honest about what I was willing to accept and what I was not. Choosing self-respect did not mean holding on to anger or resentment. It meant recognizing that my well-being mattered just as much as anyone else's expectations. The years of independence had taught me that family is not defined only by blood, but also by the presence of trust, care, and responsibility. Standing in that moment, it became clear that moving forward required protecting the life that had been built through resilience. The past had already taken enough. Refusing to reopen those wounds was not an act of cruelty, but a quiet decision to honor the strength it took to survive and create a future defined by dignity, rather than regret. When everything had been said, and the truth had settled between us, the situation revealed a lesson that reached far beyond a single family conflict. The years of struggle, growth, and eventual confrontation had created a powerful reminder about the value of dignity and the consequences of abandoning those who need support the most. Life had unfolded in a way that showed how deeply our choices can shape the future, often in ways we never expect at the time. In the beginning, my parents believed they were protecting their reputation and preserving their standing in the community. They thought that distancing themselves from a difficult situation would allow them to maintain the image they had worked so hard to build. At that moment, pride and fear of judgment from others guided their actions more strongly than compassion or responsibility. What they did not fully understand was that decisions made out of pride often carry consequences that last far longer than the embarrassment they were trying to avoid. For me, the experience became a journey defined by resilience. Being forced to face the world alone could have easily led to defeat, bitterness, or despair. Instead, the hardships became the foundation for growth. Every obstacle faced along the way strengthened the determination to build a life that was not dependent on approval from those who had once turned away. The pain that once felt unbearable gradually transformed into the strength needed to create stability and independence. When my parents finally returned years later, their regret and expectations highlighted how much time had changed the situation. They were no longer the powerful figures who once controlled every decision. Instead, they were people confronting the long-term impact of a choice they had made during a moment of anger and pride. The story ultimately became a reminder that dignity and self-respect are worth protecting, even when the people who hurt us later seek forgiveness or reconciliation. Family bonds carry great meaning, but they also require responsibility, compassion, and understanding. When those elements are absent, the damage left behind can last for years. In the end, the journey showed that resilience can transform even the most painful beginnings into a life defined by strength, and that abandoning family during their darkest moment is a decision whose consequences often return when least expected. The journey I've shared is not just a story about pain, rejection, or revenge. It is a story about what happens when someone refuses to let the worst moment of their life define their entire future. Being abandoned at the moment when support was needed most could have easily destroyed everything. It could have turned life into a path filled with bitterness, anger, and endless regret. But sometimes the very hardships that are meant to break us become the fire that forges our greatest strength. The past cannot be erased. The memories of rejection, humiliation, and loneliness will always remain a part of the story. Yet those memories no longer carry the same power they once had. Instead of being a source of weakness, they became the foundation for resilience. Every struggle, every sleepless night, and every challenge faced alone slowly built the strength needed to stand tall in a world that once felt impossible to survive. What this journey truly shows is that dignity and self-respect are more powerful than the opinions of people who judge without understanding. When someone chooses pride over compassion, they may believe they are protecting themselves in the moment, but life has a way of revealing the real cost of those decisions over time. The consequences of abandoning love and responsibility do not disappear, they simply wait for the day when truth finally catches up. At the same time, this story is also about growth. It shows that even when everything is taken away, the human spirit has an incredible ability to rebuild. Strength does not always come from comfort or easy victories. Often it grows from the hardest battles, from the moments when giving up seems like the easiest choice but moving forward becomes the only path worth taking. If there is one message to carry forward from this story, it is this: never let someone else's rejection decide the value of your life. Your future is not written by the mistakes of your past or by the people who doubted you. It is written by your courage to keep going when everything around you tells you to stop. Thank you for listening to this story and sharing this journey from pain to strength. I truly appreciate your time and attention. I wish you success, resilience, and the courage to overcome every challenge life places in your path. Good luck in everything you pursue, and may your future always be stronger than your past.